and welcome to the first part of our series, A Little R&R, with your hosts, Ringer and Rask. Part 1, Betting. Encarta defines betting as the activity of placing a bet.
As many of you probably know, betting is an integral part of poker and has been since the tragedy of 1832 that set poker back several generations, as many of the game's greats perished after folding for over 16 days straight in the inaugural FCOP.
Rest in peace, gentlemen. We didn't know.
Hey guys, so all joking aside, today Eric and I, say hi Eric actually.
Hey, how's it going, guys?
Today we're going to be talking about betting, which I know is a pretty broad and general concept. So we're going to primarily be focusing on c-betting and double barreling when you have the pre-flop initiative. And Eric, you'll probably agree with me. I think most guys on CardRunners are pretty confident when it comes to this stuff already. So hopefully what we're going to do is talk about, I guess, what you call some intermediate stuff and focus more on maybe a few other considerations in the light of like small stakes full ring that probably isn't brought up that often at this level of play.
Yeah, I mean, and as far as like just giving yourself giving yourself more, I guess, reason for doing things and kind of more understanding for the reason you already do a lot of the things you do.
Most definitely. Okay, so if you want to take us away, I guess.
Yeah, sure. And so the first thing we're going to talk about is continuation betting out of position. And that's probably going to be the majority of continuation betting. And we're going to talk about probably a few things that you guys already know. And they're kind of like the no-brainer things, but I feel like that if we're going to move forward in this presentation, obviously what we're going to want to do is go over kind of the basics and kind of touch on everything for perhaps the people that don't quite consider some of these things. And I think it's always important to like build from the fundamentals up. So first things is when you're continuation betting, board texture is going to be basically the king of deciding how often you're going to be continuation betting something. And obviously, when you're deciding how often to continuation bet, certainly such things as the success rate of how often it's going to actually work, how often you're going to merit folds, and then as well as kind of how many players saw the flop. And Rick, if you want to take kind of range assessments here, kind of talk about that.
Yeah, sure. So I mean, obviously, again, this is stuff that's it's going to be relevant to help us kind of move forward. So just what's your opponent? What's your perceived range for betting on this board? Be related to how often does your opponent think you're going to be c-betting, and where did you raise from, what types of hands are they putting you on, and then whatever you think their range happens to be. So did they call under the gun +1? Did they call on the button? What are things that might make their range wider or weaker, or include other hands that it might not normally include?
Sure, and also dynamic, which I think Rick, you had something that was really really relevant to say about like kind of the dynamic of how important dynamic really is when you're considering continuation betting. Yeah,
it's one of those things that's both very important and not important at all. It kind of depends. I mean, one thing that I will say is like whatever type of flow that you have with somebody during a session or overall should definitely influence what hands you're deciding to check give up with, or check call with, or check raise with, or c-bet with. It should definitely influence those things. I don't know if I really have anything too interesting to say about that. I mean, it's just definitely something to bear in mind, I guess. Like, I mean, I think what you mentioned earlier is like maybe you've been playing a session against somebody and they just continually fold to your c-bets. Maybe you should be,
Sure.
On the lookout for them to do something against you in the future. I don't know if that's necessarily true. That's not something that I think. Like, if I've been c-betting and some guy just continually folds to my bets, I'm more likely to keep betting because I think he likes to fold a lot. If you know what I mean.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think one of the things you said where when you're like what kind of dynamic you expect them to have, like are they bluff raising a lot of your flop c-bets? Are they like how are they interpreting your bets, and how are they like actively countering it?
Yeah, and that'll definitely that'll influence how often you bet and with what hands you bet with, and
Absolutely.
Hopefully all this stuff is going to come up later on. So it's just something to kind of be relevant of.
Okay, and then the most important thing I think that we're going to talk about a lot is certainly using your equity versus a continuing range versus an absolute hand strength range. So, Rick, I think you had
there's a few things that could probably be said about this. One mistake that I think people make way too often, and probably just in general, but in small stakes games especially, is looking at the absolute strength of their hand and not the relative strength of their hand against somebody's flop continuing range. So what you'll get a lot is the flop will come, just a random example, we'll say 10-7-4 rainbow, and somebody will c-bet with pocket fives because they have what they think is often going to be the best hand on that board.
Sure.
But what they don't realize is that when you bet with fives and get called, you're going to have most likely 2 outs at best, right?
Yeah, and even if the opponent is calling you on a hand, say as weak as a gut shot draw, I mean, they're still going to have 30% equity because they've got 2 overs plus the gut shot draw.
Yeah, and the fact is too, if somebody's going to float you on that board and you do have a hand like an under pair, you're not going to win that pot very often. But yeah, in general, I think people make the mistake of just looking at the absolute value of their hand and not the relative strength of it against somebody's continuing range. So ideally, what we're looking for is we're looking to touch more on how you can make your equity in the pot work for you versus like the range of hands that somebody's going to call or play back at your flop c-bet with.
Sure, and taking the random c-betting out of there as instead of taking just randomly c-betting something, when instead saying like when you're going to c-bet and you c-bet 80% of the time on X flop, taking the 80% best equity hands out.
Yeah, and I think people also they fall into the trap of the I have the best hand problem, where like a better example would be like when it comes to 3-betting from the blinds or getting all in pre-flop in like a 4-bet spot. People will somebody will raise in a late position and somebody we'll use an example of I don't know, king 10 offsuit or something in the big blind. And I'm not going to say whether or not it's correct to 3-bet there or not, but people will re-raise with that hand, and then they'll say, well, I re-raised with it because it was ahead of his button opening range. Not realizing that, well, that's probably true. It's definitely ahead of what most people are going to be raising with on the button. But the fact is that when you 3-bet there and somebody 4-bets you or flats or puts any more money in the pot, you very often do not have the best hand. And we're just kind of extending that basically to, when you continuation bet. So trying to choose hands that have better equity versus, somebody's flop continuing range.
And that obviously just goes completely with just make sure you're always thinking ahead. It's be like, okay, well, like if I do this, well, when our opponent continues, which is obviously the only time your hand is going to be important, like how am I going to be playing against that range?
Yeah. And that can like that. Not only does that make your continuation bets more intelligent, but it also helps a lot when it comes to double barreling. Not only with presenting you when it comes to like presenting you obvious spots to barrel. For example, you c-bet with 2 overs and a backdoor draw, and you turned your backdoor draw, so you decided to double barrel. So not only does it present you with like very obvious spots to barrel, so it kind of if you're struggling with things like that, it makes it a little bit easier. But it also makes it more like a more efficient way to bluff because you will be more likely to turn equity in the pot. You'll be more likely to turn some type of best hand that warrants another bet.
Sure, and we have an example to kind of hammer home kind of what we're talking about, where we have a example here of a pretty dry standard flop, I suppose, and we're going to kind of fool around with Poker Stove and talk about. For obviously, the first example we have is Ace King on this board. And let me go ahead and pull over Poker Stove so that you can kind of see what the equity is there. And so we've chosen just just random continuing hand. Obviously, there are other examples where like he's going to have Ace Jack, and our hand's not going to have nearly as much equity.
Yeah, the idea isn't to kind of show you how much equity you're going to have on this exact flop or to talk about, when you should be c-betting on this particular board. I mean, the intention is just to sort of show you how your equity changes with different hands against what is, I wouldn't say it's the average hand that you're going to get called by in terms of like your equity against it on the flop, but basically just to show you how your equity changes based on what hand you actually have on certain boards. So in this example, you have, what is often going to be 2 over cards. And you're going to have, 22% is not really that bad, right?
No.
So when it comes to c-betting on this board, at the times where you're called, you're probably going to run it like a little bit less than this on average, but you're going to have, you're going to be entitled to a decent amount of this pot when you bet. Now the next example that you have is...
Sure. So now we have kind of the example we just talked about where we have pocket fives now.
Which is, clearly ahead of Ace King on the flop.
Yep,
However...
absolutely.
If you want to bring the stove back over,
yep. Let me go ahead and plug it in, and there we go.
When you bet and get called by this hand, your equity falls dramatically, which is, should be obvious to just about anybody, right? So now we've got about like a little over 8.5%, which clearly like 2 outs is not really that good, even though you're 2 outer maybe to pretty much the nuts on this board.
Yeah, there's some cold nuts, pretty much.
Yeah, you're sacrificing a ton of equity to get it though, right? And then the final example that you've got is...
Sure, and I think that this is kind of the most interesting part of this discussion, and definitely the part that I found the most interesting in the consideration of betting is something like the backdoor draw, with a hand that's got a couple of backdoor draws.
Fairly weak ones. But
yeah, like a 5-6 suited here.
Even though, so when you compare a hand like pocket fives to 5-6 suited, you notice you got about 2% more, which is really obviously it seems kind of insignificant, but if you ran these hands out millions of times, this is actually going to make a fairly big difference, like just having this extra little bit of equity. Or in general, if you had to pick between which hand to c-bet on this board, fairly, I wouldn't say it's obvious or it's totally clear, 100% sure thing that you should be c-betting 5-6 suited over pocket fives. But, in general, where you're going to run with a little bit better equity versus a continuing range when you have something as weak as 6 high with a couple of backdoor draws.
And I think something that's also important with the 5-6 that got me kind of thinking was think about how many turn cards are going to come off and that you're going to feel okay betting at, whereas the turn cards when you have pocket fives, really, you're not going to have, if you didn't improve on the turn, your equity is basically gone for the most part.
Yeah, with a hand like 5-6 suited, even though this equity calculation includes the times where you turn a flush draw,
sure, absolutely,
it makes for more intelligent double barrels. So maybe you find yourself in a spot where somebody peels this flop against you, and you turn a flush draw, and because you've turned that draw, you're able to fire, to pull the trigger and bet again, and you get him to fold some type of second pair hand or gut shot that he's peeling with that otherwise would have won the pot had you just checked with pocket fives.
Sure, and and probably the gut shot isn't and yeah, for example, if he did have something like ace-9, for example, and the turn did come, say the 4 or say the 7 or say even the deuce or any heart, like the king of hearts, ace of hearts, etc. Which obviously those are going to be good barrel cards, anyways, for the most part.
But no, you can you'll be able to you have more equity in general when you're bluffing, which is good,
sure.
And it might even give you the balls to pull the trigger, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely, and I'd say that's probably the best way to
or it makes it more obvious when you should continue bluffing. Whereas with pocket fives, what should you be thinking about when you barrel this turn? Maybe that's subject for another video. I don't really know, but
you should be thinking, please fold.
Yeah, basically, and that's kind of what you're relying on. Now,
sure.
Another example that we had was ace-5 of diamonds on this board. Sure. Where if you want to plug that in really quickly too.
Absolutely.
Where you take a hand like this, which doesn't really look like much. Most people would treat those ace-5 of diamonds the same as 5-6 suited on this board, but you're clearly going to average much more equity. Now, it's probably not going to be quite 17%, but you definitely, oftentimes you're going to have an overcard and two fairly decent backdoor draws. So, kind of what we're just trying to focus on, I guess, is basically just how it is still relevant to choose the hands with the best equity to c-bet with.
Yeah, and I think the key is granted, for example, on a certain board that say you're going to be c-betting 90% of the time. A lot of the times, I think that what we're trying to hammer home here is pick the 10% of the hands there that have the least amount of equity. Now, granted, pocket fives might not fall into that category, but say now instead we're only c-betting this flop, say 65% of the time, which probably would be too low, but let's say in your game that's perhaps the problem that you have. You're only c-betting 65% of the time. Then pocket fives probably would not be falling into that category.
Yeah, sure. You're just picking the stuff that just is doing really poorly against the continuing ranges, choosing to check fold with that, and then to c-bet with hands that actually give you a chance at winning or give you a chance to improve on later. Yeah,
and probably we've discussed some of the hands are more disguised than others as far as which ones you should be betting.
Most definitely.
And backdoor draws become relevant. So we'll get the stove out of here and continue with the presentation.